She walked in his room, flipped on the light, and said, it's time to get up and get ready for church. His reply was, I don't want to go. And she said, well, why's that? And he said, well, for a couple of reasons, maybe. He said, the people there don't like me. It's too early, I'd rather sleep. And most of all, the sermons are so boring. And she said, well, too bad, you need to get up and go anyway. And he said, well, you just give me 3 good reasons why I should do that. She said, well, number 1, because I'm your mother and you need to do what I tell you. Number 2, you're 40 years old and it's time you began taking some responsibility for yourself. And number 3, you're the preacher and they expect you to show up. I'm really glad to see you all this morning because you kind of had a trifecta working against you today. It's unseasonably cold out there. It would surely have felt nice to just snuggle under the covers a little while longer. A lot of you just got back off a spring break, probably just got in from a trip, so you're worn out from that. And what's the other one? Well, we just went into daylight savings time, which means you lost that precious hour of sleep. But I can't tell by looking at you. You're all looking pretty spry and pretty lively. And when we think about all of that, we realize that you're here because you made a choice. Mark often mentions that, and it's so true. You make a choice to be here. There's nothing that is externally just compelling you. You're not going to be fined by the government if you decide not to show up. And so you made a decision to come and be here. And that's expected. We're a family. We're the body of Christ, and we expect one another to come together, as Hebrews tells us, to not forsake our assembling of ourselves together. But we also recognize that we need each other, don't we? It's good for us to be here. It's good for us to see one another's faces and to be encouraged. It's good for us to sing these wonderful songs of faith that build us up and give us hope and strengthen us for the struggles that we endure in life. It's good that we can come together and lift up our voices in prayer before the throne of God to receive the things that we so stand in need of. It's good that we gather, as we now do right off the bat, around this table that the Lord has prepared for us in the presence of a hostile world, where we are nourished and we are fed in our faith as we remember and we reflect upon the source of our salvation. But not only are we choosing to be here, not only is it good for us to be here from that standpoint, there's a deeper level. As I grow older in my walk with the Lord, I become more and more conscious of the fact that it's not just that I'm in pursuit of Christ, which I am, but that He's in pursuit of me. There's a poem, 18th century poem called "The Hound of Heaven." Some of you may have read that. It's written about by a man who was the son of a doctor, I believe, and had high expectations and high hopes, but somehow or other he became addicted to opioids, and his life just fell apart. And he struggled this way, he struggled that way, he went in every direction in life, but throughout his life he said he could always hear the footsteps of the hound of heaven. It's the way he referred to Christ, pursuing him, running him down, until at last he captured him. And I feel like I said, in my life, the older I get, the more I realize that Christ is always there. And every time I wander away in my foolishness and turn around, there He is, calling me back. And that's so much a part of what this supper is about. It's every week He's calling us back again to Him. And it says in John chapter 12, verse 32, that Jesus predicted that this would be the case. That's where He says, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." I'm intrigued by that word, draw. He doesn't mean draw like some of our young people who are really good artists and draw a picture. pictures, but to draw somebody by the power of an attraction, like a magnet draws steel to itself, like a well draws the thirsty, like bread and the smell of a bakery draws the hungry in the morning. Jesus says, I will draw all people to myself. There's an attracting power of Christ, but he says specifically, when I am lifted up, will draw all men to myself. And in the next verse, what does he say? He says he spoke this to indicate by what death he would die. And so the idea is that when Jesus, and you can almost in your mind's eye see this image of him having been nailed to this cross, and then the soldiers by a series of pulleys and ropes most likely would lift that cross up, and everyone would look upon him and see him there. And Jesus says, when I'm lifted up, I'll draw by an attractive force people to myself. That's a strange thing to say if you think about it. Because a crucifixion and a death by crucifixion is perhaps the most repulsive thing that I can think of. There may be some strange people who are fascinated by death and by suffering, would be attracted to such a spectacle, but most of us would just avert our eyes from such a horrific scene. The descriptions that I've read from people who saw Roman crucifixions and witnessed them, there are sounds, the screams, the groans, smells, the flies, and then just the scene visually. Almost every one of our senses are just pushed away by the thought even of a crucifixion. And Jesus says, when I am lifted up, I will draw people to myself. Paul acknowledges that crucifixion has this odd effect of repelling some, and Jesus' crucifixion in particular of drawing some. When he writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, these words. He says, for since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly that we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are, and notice the word, but to those who are called, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And so Paul says, yes, for various reasons, there will be those who are repelled by not only the cross in general, but by Jesus' death on the cross in particular. But there are some that, strangely enough, this is going to draw them to it. In spite of all of the horrific and offensive things about it, some will be drawn to it. Again, the horror of this death is well described by Tom Holland in his, he's a classical scholar, and he says of crucifixion, no death was more excruciating, more contemptible than crucifixion. To be hung naked, long in agony, helpless to beat away the flies and the birds. So foul was the reek of their disgrace that many felt tainted even by viewing a crucifixion. But to those who are called are drawn to it. And again, it's not that we're drawn to some macabre fascination with death and suffering, but it's because of the reason why this particular person died on the cross. You see, all of the other crucifixions that the Romans performed were performed on an unwilling victim. None of the other people, I would venture to say, that Rome ever crucified, ever stepped forward and allowed themselves freely to be taken when they could have, if they had had the power at their disposal, to call legions of angels to destroy the earth, to destroy their enemies, to set him free. All of the others would have taken that option, but Jesus willingly went to the cross. And I think that gets us a step closer to understanding why we would see it as something so attractive that would draw us ever nearer. Unlike any who ever died before, Jesus was there by his own decision. In fact, back in John chapter 12 and in verse 27, he puts it like this as he begins this whole section in John. He says, "Now is my soul troubled." And why wouldn't it be? In anticipation of the cross, he is speaking, "Now is my soul troubled." At this point in the Gospel of John, it is drawing very near. He knows what is on the horizon. The crucifixion is just over the horizon. And now he says, "My soul is troubled," as my imagination begins to take hold and I see what is before me. "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? Father, just get me out of this. Take this all away." "No," he says. "It was for this very reason that I came to this hour." And so Jesus, in full recognition of what was before him, fully understanding the pain, the agony, the shame, the disgrace, all of it that would go with his public execution and with the beating that would precede it, with all of that in mind and with great trouble of spirit naturally and recoiling from such suffering and such shame, he asks the question, should I just back out of this? Should I seek another way around? And then he remembers, this is the reason that I came. This is what I was sent here to do. And so having loved his own, he loved them to the end. And so he willingly absorbed the power of sin and sorrow and death for you and for me. And his righteous soul, as it were, soaked up the full force of evil and took it down into the depths of the earth, when he is buried there. And there he left it all behind, to rise again in victory over sin and sorrow and death. So that while we still experience the shadow of death, he has taken away the substance of death. And we know that death does not have the final answer, and sin is not the master anymore. But in Jesus there is victory, there is hope, and there is deliverance. Because we see that Jesus willingly absorbed this on our behalf and has overcome it, we are now strangely drawn to this spectacle of his death on the cross. So much so that week after week we would come together to eat and to drink and remember and proclaim his death. So that's why we're here. And Paul, the apostle, tells us that each time we assemble together on the Lord's Day, we partake of this feast. And in doing so, we reflect, we remember what was accomplished on that cross on our behalf. We see Jesus lifted up in our mind's eye, suffering and dying not for his own sins, but for the sins of his people. Absorbing, as it were, all the evil that had poisoned this earth, taking it in himself so that he could bury it and bring something fresh and bring something new and bring life into a dying world. And so we remember and we proclaim that until he comes. I think that that's an important element of this for us to grasp, is that in the eating of this supper, in the remembering, in the partaking, and in the remembering, we are also proclaiming. We're proclaiming to a world that Jesus died for their sins as well as for our own, and that that's where their hope should rest. And so in this way, we are lifting him up again, not to crucify him afresh, but lifting up the reality of what he has accomplished on the cross for all the world to see. And the fact that you chose to get up this morning, of all mornings, shows the drawing power of Christ and proclaims to a world the value of what we remember and celebrate this morning. At this time, we'll ask those who are going to serve to come forward, and John Casebolt will lead us in the prayers for the supper.